Can you guys hear me? All right. So thanks for joining me today. I'm going to talk about a topic that I think is one of the most sensitive topics on the Magento development space, which is development environments. And I will present GitHub Codespaces as a solution for this problem and how we can use it to solve it. So I'm Igor Miura. I'm a senior software engineer at Magento Video. And these are the topics that I'm going to cover during this presentation, but essentially I will talk about all these challenges and issues we face with Magento development environments and how we can use GitHub Codespace to solve these problems. So first, I would like to start talking about a little bit about the development life cycle. So this is usually how things happen on the development side. So a developer is assigned first to a task, and then if it's the first time working on a project, he or she will have to set up a local environment that matches the production or the staging environments, meaning they must have the same PHP version, database, Elasticsearch, and everything. Then we have to import a database. So, of course, not having any sensitive data like customers, orders, or cards. And then the developer can actually start to write the code, QA, and then move to staging and to production. But this second piece here, where they have to set up a local environment, sometimes takes a lot of time. And these problems, this takes a lot of time because a couple of problems. So first, Magento requires different services for an environment. So we have to set up a web server with PHP. Then we have the database ready. So we have to set up all these services in order to have a Magento development environment. Part of this setup includes importing the database, so someone has to go and export the database, remove any sensitive data, and then we can actually import this database. Also, developers, they are hardly ever working on a single project, so this process of setting up development environments, they will have to go through this process for all the projects they are working on. And this leads into an efficiency problem because they cannot spend all of their time just working on the tasks and on the development, but they have to handle this development infrastructure setup every time they are working on a new project. It also can require a DevOps person or someone like more a senior engineer to help them if they are junior, because maybe they don't have experience to deal with these infrastructure issues. Also, to host a Magento environment, we need to have a computer with a good amount of memory and CPU, because as we need to stand up all those services, it requires resources to run them. And all of these, compiled is an even bigger problem for agencies, because agencies will have many teams with many developers, and if most of them are dealing with this type of problems, they are, at the end of the day, they are losing money because of that. So GitHub recently released a new service called Codespace. So essentially, this service allows us to deploy a containerized development environment that is connected with our GitHub repository. This development environment is hosted on Microsoft Azure. So these environments, they are deployed based on a file that we specify, like what containers are we deploying and what is included and needed for this development instance. And this process, to read this file and deploy this infrastructure takes around 2 minutes. It's very fast. These development environments, they are not shared between developers, so it means every developer working on a project will have their own environment, so they don't share and they don't work together on these environments with anyone else. All these environments, they are also based on a specific Git branch, so it means If I'm working on, let's say, multiple tasks on the same project, I will have a single environment for each one of them, so I can work on them like isolated. This service is also fully integrated with Visual Studio Code, and JetBrains is also working on an integration for that, but it's still in beta. And these development instances, they are billable per hour, so it means for every hour we are running these development environments, they are going to charge us, and we are going to pay for this service as part of our monthly GitHub bill. So essentially, instead of having to install Docker or even Native or any other tool to run these development environments in my local computer, I can have this cloud environment where I can write my code, QA, and do whatever I need, and I don't have to worry about setting up anything on my local environment. So this is the website where GitHub displays and they demonstrate everything that is included on this Codespace service. They also describe the plans and pricing. But essentially, this is the infrastructure that we have behind this service. So on the left side, we can see our GitHub repository. And here on this example, I have two different development environments. Each one is using a different Git branch. And essentially, inside of these cloud environments, I have a main container. And then I also have other containers for the additional services that my Magento environment needs. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is a containerized development infrastructure. So it means it expects to deploy one main container, and this main container is the one that is connected with our GitHub repository. So it means every time these environments they are created, our code will be automatically there on this main container, and this main container is the only one that we can directly access, make changes, and actually use for our development environment. Then at the bottom, we have the developers. They will connect to this cloud development environments through an SSH connection. But this connection is not something that we have to set up manually or anything. It's automatically handled by this service that I will show in a little bit. So just mention about the pricing for using this service. So they have different type of instances for running these cloud development environments. The one that I recommend for Magento development environments is the one with 8 cores, and it costs 72 cents per hour that we use it, but we also have 15 hours free every month. So how we set up this service and how we can use it with our project. So Microsoft created a standard for a JSON file that is called a dev container JSON file. And this file basically defines like what is the container that is going to be deployed, what are the ports that are going to be exposed from this container. So this file has a lot of different fields that we can use to define all of this infrastructure that is going to be deployed. There are also different ways of defining that. They have multiple options of defining this file. So you can check this containers.dev website. Is the website Microsoft has all the documentation about this template file. But essentially, we need to just create in our repository a folder called .dev container with this dev container.json file. And in this file, we will define everything that we need to deploy this development environment. So here I have an example of what this file would look like for a Magento environment. So as I said, it's just a JSON file. At the top, I'm just defining like what is the host requirements for this development environment. So I'm saying I need at least the instance type that has 8-core CPU. And then I define like what is my main container, what are the other containers that I'm going to deploy to this cloud environment. But as I mentioned previously, there are multiple ways of working with this dev container file. And one of them is using a Docker compose file as part of my setup. So if you guys are familiar with Docker compose, so it's just another file where we define like all the containers for each one of the services that is going to be deployed. So instead of defining all of those containers directly here on this dev container.json file, I'm going to use a Docker compose file. This Docker compose file is pretty common when deploying and working with Docker for local development environments, so some of you might be familiar with that. I have also here an example. I don't know if it's possible to see it very well, but this is an example of a Docker compose file that is just deploying a container to be my main container, the web server container, one for RabbitMQ, one for Elasticsearch, and all the other services. So I'm using these two files to deploy this cloud development environment through GitHub Codespaces. One thing that I think is also worth to mention that I think is pretty cool when using this service. So I mentioned that it is fully integrated with Visual Studio Code. And on this dev container.json file, we can also define what are the Visual Studio Code extensions that are going to be automatically installed every time we stand up a new cloud environment using this service. So for example, here I listed 5 extensions that I think are useful when working with Magento development. For example, the Huva code snippets, Magento code snippets, Xdebug. So these are things that usually developers will have to install and set up manually. But if we define this on this dev container.json file, every time they create a new development environment, they are going to be automatically installed and they don't have to do that manually. So we can also automate all of this process because it's also something that developers sometimes take time, to set up. So as this is like all about containers and we are deploying containers for all of these services in order to set up this Magento environment. So this diagram is just to demonstrate a little bit how we manage all these containers and what is used to deploy this infrastructure. So basically, we are getting the official images from Docker Hub for all the services like RabbitMQ, Elasticsearch, the database. But we are creating our custom web server image, installing some of the tools that we think are useful for Magento development. For example, MageRun, Xdebug, Blackfire. So our main container is going to use this custom image that we created, but the other instances for the additional services are going to be just the official ones. All right, so I was talking about how we can set up this service. Now, let's say I created this dev container.json file, also my Docker compose file. So how can I actually start to use this service on my project, on my repository? So as soon as we push these changes to our repository and we reload the page on the GitHub website, if we click on the code button, we will see a new tab. So we usually see just this local tab where it has the commands to clone the repository. But now it also has this Codespace tab. So here, if we use this plus button or if we click on the 3 dot buttons, we can initialize a new development environment through Codespace. So I can choose, for example, this new with option from this page. And it will show me this page where I can choose what is the branch that is going to be used, to get my code base from the repository. What is the dev container file that is specify what is going to be deployed as my cloud development infrastructure? What is the region? I can specify the region. And also the meshing type, but by default it's going to be the 8 core one that I specified on my dev container.json file. So once I click on this create code space button, it will start to download the images for me and set up everything for me. On my previous slide, when I was showing the Docker compose file, was not able to see here, but I have also a volume declared on the database container that is also going to import a database dump for me. So as part of this process, we are also automatically importing the database, so developers don't need to do that manually once this environment is up and running. Once this process of downloading the images and setting up everything is completed, we will see a web version of Visual Studio Code. So I can actually use it if I want. I can see the code base on the left. I have a terminal here at the bottom. So this is actually connected to the cloud development environment. So it means everything I do here and any command that I run is not going to be executed on my local machine, but is going to use this cloud environment. But if I don't want to use this web version, I also have the option to use my local app of Visual Studio Code, or even use the JetBrains Gateway app to use PHP Storm. As I mentioned, these instances, they are going to charge us for every hour they are running, so I can just stop them or delete them if I want. So let's say I created an environment and I'm working on a task, and I just finish it, it's ready to go. I can just come here, stop, so I'm not going to be charged for this instance anymore. Same to delete. If I'm not going to use it at all, I can just delete it. But if you are part of a GitHub organization, you can also define a policy. So you can define, for example, if an instance is not in use for 30 minutes, it will be automatically stopped. Same if it's not used like for 5 days, it will be automatically deleted. So you avoid like paying for these instances that are not in use. So I know I went pretty fast. I mean, it's a lot of content to go, piece by piece during the presentation, but I will be here the rest of the day if you guys want to continue this conversation. But essentially, I think this is a good fit for us in case, we have multiple developers, multiple teams, and we have a lot of difficulties like developers wasting time setting up local environments, and then things are are breaking. So as an agency, I think using something like that will avoid us to have to deal with this type of problems every time. I have some final notes. One is if it is possible to use multiple dev container files. So it is possible. At Imagination Media, we have usually 3 different dev container files. We use one just for a regular development environment. One is also a development environment, but with Xdebug, and one with Blackfire. Also, why we not use Magento Cloud Dev environments instead of this service? Because they are kind of similar. But first, not everyone is on Magento Cloud, and also the Magento Cloud branch environments, they are pretty slow because they have limited resource. So it doesn't offer a good experience for developers. And also, can we have these environments public? So as they are not running on any local machine, they are cloud environments, can I expose them and make them public? Yes, that's possible. But, these are just development environments, so I don't recommend to do that very often. Also, can I restrict users allowed to run code spaces inside my organization? Yes, you can define what are the users that you are going to pay to use GitHub Codespace. So you don't allow everyone to use, and you start to pay for all of them. And Just talking about, I know a little bit about our experience using Codespace. We have been using for almost 2 months, I think. And developers are pretty happy because, I mean, they don't have to install like Docker or anything local anymore. We have a lot of people working out of the country, so it was also a problem for us because during the onboarding process, you have to provide a computer, and depending of where this developer is based, it's something that sometimes is difficult. Sometimes that person doesn't fit in the company, and you have to go through the same process again. So with GitHub Codespace, we can have like everyone up and running very quickly, and it helps us as an agency on this process. So yeah, I think that's it. If anyone has any questions, thank you.
Thanks. What does it look like to commit code from one of these development environments? Are you just running normal Git commands, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, so one cool thing that it also has, it's automatically connected with your GitHub users. So as I said, these environments, they are not shared between different developers. So it means every time you stand up a development environment, it is automatically connected with your Git account. So you can just run the Git commands directly on the command line. But also, like if you are using Visual Studio Code, it has a tab for just Git commands and process. So you can also use that if you want, like to see things in a better visual way. But you can just run the Git commands and push code.
More questions? Okay, then a question from myself, please. As a vendor of extensions, we have this need to set up quickly environments for like QA people. They're not that technical. They just need like a blank Magento, a few extensions to do the QA part. So would your solution work for that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like these environments, they are not shared, but there is a possibility of making them public. But I think in this example, it's just a matter of creating a branch, installing the modules or extensions that I need to debug. And I mean, in 2 minutes, you have an environment up and running. But I think it's also a good case for using this type of service.
Okay, thank you. And one more question that you have. Okay, so for example, as an agency, if you need a local environment to work on a client's project, you would obviously need the same database structure, but obviously you don't need that confident data that should not be there. So how do you address that?
Yeah, so as part of this setup, we export, when we are setting up Codespace for a project for the first time, we create a database dump removing any sensitive data. And then we clean up all the tables that we don't need, like logs, reports, or anything. So we can generate a dump of 5 or 6 megabytes. And we include it as part of our repository. So every time these environments are being created, they are also imported on these environments. But I mean, like every month or every 2 months, we will probably have to update this database dump because catalog changes, some other things change. But the database is also part of this process.
So that's basically manual. You prepare the DB dump manually.
Yeah, you prepare manually, but once it is on the repository, then all these in development environments, they will automatically import it. So you just need to export only one time, include it as part of the Codespace setup, but then all the developers will have it.
Any more questions? Oh, I see.
Do you usually use that web IDE, or do you connect your local to it?
Yeah, I usually use Visual Studio app on my local, and I just map the ports, the port 80 from my machine to the cloud environment. But basically, you are not like using any of your local resources to run this environment. It's just a matter of having the IDE and everything's on the cloud.
Any more questions? Okay, then we can thank Igor,
you.
yes, for his presentation.